Great. So we are moving on to the People in Nature Lab seminar part of the day. And it's my great pleasure to welcome Jasmin Upton from UNEP-WCMC to give the seminar. And so Jas works on the Protected Planet Initiative at WCMC and also leads their work on territories and areas conserved by Indigenous peoples and manages the ICCA Registry. So look forward to hearing about that. Jas holds an M.Res vet from UCL. Was it for you here in 2014 or
2017?
2017?
Yeah.
2017. Oh
yeah.
Wow!
With Tim and with Peggy. So we were fellows.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great year.
Great.
So you had to say that. You had to say that.
No. And yeah, so really thrilled to hear from you. So over to you, and we will have questions at the end.
Thank you so much. Thanks for coming and listening to me talk today. We've had. Can they see me? This is fine.
Yeah. The owl.
Yes,
So just
moves.
go
Okay.
wherever you want because the owl will
Cool.
pick you up.
Yeah, so for those who are online and are maybe just joining us, we've had a really excellent morning where we've had a series of talks from researchers at the People in Nature Lab, and it's just been really fascinating. So thank you for having us along. Thank you for talking to us. And yeah, I was just reflecting on how nice it was to have 3-minute long talks because you can just, really get all of the really important information in such a nice, concise way. And I'm about to talk to you for 45 minutes, so I'm really sorry about that. And maybe just put your hand up if you're getting bored and want me to move on to another slide or something. But yeah, I'm really happy to be back at UCL as well, albeit in a brand new, huge, amazing building, and with all new people except Tim, Kate, and Peggy, who are familiar faces. So yeah, really happy to be here with you today. So I'm going to be talking about the work that we do at UNEP-WCMC on protected and conserved areas and protected and conserved area data based on the Protected Planet Initiative. And I'm going to be talking about how this feeds into global policy and tracks global targets on protected and conserved areas. I'm going to particularly be focusing on Target 3 of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. Maybe put your hand up if you've heard of that before, just to get, have you heard of that target? A couple, okay, interesting. I wasn't sure how many people in the room would be familiar with the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, so that's good for me to know as I'm talking through my slides. But so this target is really focused on expanding and enhancing the world's protected and conserved areas, and so I'm going to be talking about how we are actually monitoring that target. Yes. Okay, so I'm going to start by going back to basics on what exactly protected and conserved areas are. I'm then going to introduce Target 3 of the KMGBF. So talk about how protected and conserved areas fit into global policy, and then speak about Protected Planet, which is this tool we use to collate data on these areas and monitor progress towards these targets. And then we can do a bit of forward looking into whether protected and conserved areas can help halt biodiversity loss. Starting with an introduction to where I work. So I work at the UN Environment Programme World Conservation Monitoring Centre, or UNEP-WCMC for short. This is our lovely office and our really lovely pond in Cambridge. The pond doesn't look like that right now. But yeah, we'd love you guys to come and visit and talk about your work to us one day. That would be really nice. So what we do is essentially aim to make sure that biodiversity can be at the heart of decision making, and we do that by working with governments, NGOs, and civil society and businesses to make sure that, biodiversity decision making is at the heart of national and global policy. And we provide a lot of support to UN conventions related to biodiversity as well, and any of the multilateral environmental agreements that are adopted under those conventions. All All right, so starting with the basics of what exactly are protected and conserved areas, I'm going to talk about this because I think it's important to understand what area-based conservation measures exist today and what's actually considered as part of this target. I don't think I need to tell you what a protected area is because I know that you are familiar with them. I'm pretty sure that you've definitely been in at least one protected area in your life. There are so many different types across the world: national parks, nature reserves, community conserved areas, forest reserves, the list goes on. They have been central to countries' conservation strategies for the past 150 years. And they are broadly defined as areas of the world that are set aside primarily for conserving biodiversity. So there are these two definitions which are considered equivalent. More recently, a new form of area-based conservation has come around, and these are called other effective area-based conservation measures, or for short, these are called OECMs. So you might have heard the term OECM. If not, that's okay. So the terminology OECM was first brought into the CBD negotiations of the ICCA biodiversity targets. So these are the targets that ran under the CBD from 2010 to 2020. And ICCA biodiversity target 11 was the target that related to protected and conserved areas. And in that target, in the final stage of negotiation, they added that this target should be aimed at increasing protected areas and other effective area-based conservation measures. At the time, they didn't have a clue what that meant because it wasn't until 8 years later, so in 2018, that these areas were actually formally defined. And what they essentially encompass is any areas outside of protected areas that are contributing to biodiversity, regardless of how they are being managed. So they don't have to be managed for biodiversity conservation. So the aim of the OECMs is to be able to capture all of these pre-existing ways that we are managing the world and our lands and waters in ways that are contributing to biodiversity. So there are lots of important areas that we should also be recognising for those biodiversity values. Okay, so the really key difference between protected areas and OECMs is around this primary management objective. So protected areas are primarily managed for biodiversity conservation, whereas OECMs can be managed for lots of different reasons. They can only be OECMs where that management is producing biodiversity outcomes, so where they are contributing to biodiversity conservation. And this concept is important because there are lots of areas in the world that fall outside of our current protected area network. And some examples of this might be sacred natural sites that can be incredibly biodiverse, but actually they're primarily being managed for their cultural and spiritual values by faith groups. Another example might be military lands, which are primarily obviously managed for defence, but actually they can be really biodiverse. So when we think of like Salisbury Plains in the UK, for example. So there are all of these areas that because of the fact that protected areas must be primarily managed for conservation, there are a lot of areas that fall outside of that we're not currently recognising for their conservation values, and that it's important that we're sustaining in the long term. So that's why OECMs came about. I hope that makes sense. All right, the aim of this diagram is to show you that protected and conserved areas can be really diverse in terms of how they are being managed and governed. So as I said, there are lots of different types of protected areas across the world. And often what can mean one type of protected area in one part of the world can be very different in other parts. So what constitutes a national park in Kenya is very different from a national park in the UK, for example. So the IUCN develops these categories to be able to class protected areas based on their management objectives. So this ranges from category 1A, where you have sort of strict protection levels and limited access and control, all the way through to category 6, where you can have sustainable use alongside conservation. So there is a misconception that in protected areas, conservation has to, or people have to be separate from nature, but actually there are lots of protected areas across the world where you can have some form of sustainable use, as long as it doesn't impinge on overall conservation of those areas. OECMs are classified slightly differently, so you can have, so they're classified on whether they have conservation as their primary objective, as their secondary objective, or whether actually it's just an unintended consequence of how these sites are being managed. Moving on to the right-hand side, it's just to show that these areas can also be governed by lots of different actors. So governance is speaking about who is making the decisions about those areas. And actually you can have government protected and conserved areas, but you can also have privately governed ones governed by Indigenous peoples and local communities, and through shared governance arrangements as well. So some examples might be RSPB nature reserves in the UK, or Indigenous protected areas in Australia as another example. So the takeaway from this is that these areas are really diverse in how they're being governed and managed, and lots of different actors are involved in the world's protected and conserved areas. Okay, I won't talk about this one for too long, but this is just to show that so countries often have national definitions and policies for what they consider protected in their countries. Often these areas can be legally protected, but it's not a requirement of protected and conserved areas. They can also be recognised non-legally through other effective means, such as through customary laws of Indigenous peoples and local communities, or through the policies of NGOs. We also have areas that are recognised at the regional and international level through conventions like the World Heritage Convention or the Ramsar Convention, which you might be familiar with. All right, so moving on to where these areas fit into global policy, and focusing on Target 3 of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. So firstly, this framework, what exactly is it? So back in 2022, parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity, countries basically, came together in Montreal and adopted this really historic framework for reshaping the world's relationship with nature. And the framework was designed to help achieve the CBD's overarching 2050 vision of a world living in harmony with nature. So it's called the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, or the KMGBF. It has 4 long-term goals to be achieved by 2050 and 23 action-oriented targets to be achieved by 2030. Now, what's really important about what was adopted at this meeting in Montreal is that not only was a framework for reshaping the world's relationships with nature adopted, but a monitoring framework was adopted too. And this monitoring framework will allow us to essentially monitor how well we are actually achieving the goals and targets of the KMGBF. So it's a set of indicators that will focus on monitoring those goals and targets, and that's going to be really important in actually having a mechanism for accountability of how well are we actually achieving this framework that we've committed to. Here's an overview of the 23 targets. So you can see that target 3 sits within this much broader scope of targets that are quite different. So you have targets that relate to reducing threats to biodiversity. You then have targets that are focused on meeting people's needs and benefit sharing. You then have tools and solutions for actually implementing the targets in the framework as well. So there are lots of different targets there that are all considered important by CBD parties for reshaping our relationship with nature. And target 3, although it has attracted quite a lot of attention in the run-up to the negotiations of this framework and subsequent to the adoption of it as well, it's attracted quite a lot of attention, but actually all of the 23 targets are going to be important in achieving this framework. All right, so this is target 3. I spend most of my life looking at this small paragraph. So yeah, so it's quite a complex target, and I will take you through it in a more engaging way using a diagram. But I think it's important for maybe someone who isn't so familiar with policy and how these negotiations happen, is just to mention that every bit of wording that is in that target is heavily negotiated on. And so there is a lot that goes into every word that is put in there and the impact that it can have on how we deliver on this target. So let's break it down for you. So the target essentially tells us what we need to protect, where we need to protect, how to do it, and then some considerations that we need to follow whilst we're implementing the target. It is a global target, right? So it's a global framework and it's a global target, but countries are encouraged to make the target and how they implement the target specific to their national context, so that the implementation of that target is appropriate in their national context. So that means the where and the how elements of these targets are going to look very different in terms of how they're actually done in between different countries. So target 3 calls on countries to ensure and enable that by 2030, at least 30% of terrestrial and inland waters and of coastal and marine areas, especially areas of particular importance for biodiversity and ecosystem functions and services, are effectively conserved and managed through ecologically representative, well-connected and equitably governed systems of protected areas and other effective area-based conservation measures, recognising Indigenous and traditional territories. I will come back to this part of the text. And integrated into wider landscapes, seascapes and the ocean, while ensuring that any sustainable use, where appropriate in such areas, is fully consistent with conservation outcomes. So I did just speak about how we can have sustainable use in these areas, but they must be consistent with conservation outcomes. And then finally, recognising and respecting the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities, including over their traditional territories. This final bit of the text that relates to human rights and the recognition of the roles of Indigenous peoples and local communities was included due to a really strong advocacy effort from Indigenous peoples and their supporting partners. And it's a really crucial part of the target in ensuring that the implementation of this target is not done in a way that will violate human rights, which, as I'm sure you're familiar, has been an issue in the past when it comes to area-based conservation. And actually, the entire KMGBF has a strong inclusion of upholding human rights throughout its implementation. And that's, yeah, really a major achievement for the world, but for the CBD to have such a strong recognition of the need to be upholding rights in the implementation of the framework. So as I mentioned, Target 3 talks about recognising Indigenous and traditional territories. This is because it's understood that Indigenous peoples and local communities govern a lot of the world's land and seas, and that actually they hold a lot of the world's remaining biodiversity. So it's really important that they are appropriately recognised for those contributions within this target. As I mentioned earlier, that you can have protected areas and OECMs under the governance of Indigenous peoples and local communities. But there is a process and discussions ongoing within the CBD at the moment to recognise Indigenous and traditional territories as a distinct approach to protected areas and OECMs. So a distinct approach that Indigenous peoples and local communities can have to be able to have their conservation efforts recognised as complementary to protected areas and OECMs. So that's going to be really important in ensuring these groups are recognised in an appropriate way moving forwards in the implementation of this target. All right, so how am I doing? Are you all still with me? Okay, I can see some smiles. So I'm going to talk for a little while about Protected Planet. So this is what I work on at UNEP-WCMC. And this is the tool that we're using to track progress towards this global target. So for those who aren't familiar, Protected Planet is a platform for collating data and sharing data on protected and conserved areas worldwide. It is a joint product of IUCN and UNEP, but it's managed on a daily basis by a team of us at UNEP-WCMC. You can see it here on the right-hand side. We have an online platform that you can go and explore. You can go and download the data. We provide lots of different types of information, including statistics that give an overview of the state of protected and conserved areas worldwide. So Protected Planet hosts several databases, the most well-known being the World Database on Protected and Conserved Areas, which collates data on the world's marine and terrestrial protected and conserved areas, protected areas and OECMs. It's a spatial database, so we collect information on their location, so their sort of digital boundaries, as well as lots of different types of descriptive information that gives information about that site. So what is its designation? Who is it being governed by? What are its management objectives? Things like that. We also have the Global Database on Protected Area Management Effectiveness, or the GDPARME, which collects information on where these sites have been assessed at the site level for how effective they are in terms of their management and governance. And then we have another database which sits slightly separately called the ICCA Registry, which is dedicated to territories and areas conserved by Indigenous peoples and local communities. We have data coming in from a huge variety of sources, so over 400 data providers from over 244 countries. It's really what keeps us busy on a daily basis. It's primarily data from national governments all over the world. So we work very closely with national governments, but we also work with convention secretariats, Indigenous peoples, local communities and private actors to collect data on the areas they're conserving. And we also have collaborations with regional entities who help us to do all of this work at a regional level. So how are these databases actually being used to track progress? So the really big benefit of bringing all of this information together in one place is to be able to monitor progress towards international targets on these areas. And so the Protected Planet database, the World Database on Protected and Conserved Areas, is formally mandated under the Convention on Biological Diversity to do this role. So we tracked progress towards the former target, Aichi Biodiversity Target 11, and now the database provides the headline indicator for Target 3 of the KMGBF. And it also provides, tracks progress towards some of the Sustainable Development Goals as well that relate to protected and conserving the world's land and water. One of the ways in which we can monitor progress towards these targets is through a report series that we publish. So every 2 to 3 years, we publish a report called the Protected Planet Report. And the idea of this report is to be able to go further beyond the statistics that we publish on a daily basis on the Protected Planet website. And what we do is we take the data we manage and we overlay it with lots of different types of other biodiversity data to give us a much better picture of the state of protected and conserved areas. So we can look at things like how connected these areas are, how well they're covering areas that are important for biodiversity and things like that. The 2024 report that we recently published was the first report providing an assessment of this global status of Target 3 of the KMGBF. So that's the target I just talked you through. And so we did this working in partnership with custodians of those other data sets, but also custodians of other indicators. And what we did was break down the target into its different elements, and wherever there were defined indicators within the monitoring framework of the KMGBF, we assessed those indicators. So I'm going to take you through some of the findings of that report. So starting with coverage, so this is looking at just how much of our world is covered by protected and conserved areas. We currently have over 17% of land and inland waters covered by protected and conserved areas, and almost 10% of marine and coastal areas. So you can see here the data represented in this map. So these are all of the world's protected and conserved areas today based on our databases. You can also see the change in these areas over time from 2000. So you can see that sort of with the adoption of Aichi Biodiversity Target 11, there was this like scale up in implementation of protected and conserved areas based on these policy targets. But the other thing to note here, so of course, Target 3 aims to protect 30% of land and sea. And so what we know is that we need to significantly scale up our ambition on this area, this part of the target, because we need a further 12% of land in terms of coverage and a further 20% of sea in terms of coverage to meet the 30% coverage element of Target 3. Some water. All right, so moving on to so Target 3 recognises that these areas will only be effective if they actually protect biodiversity. So we can look at how these areas are covering areas that are important for biodiversity. There are lots of different tools or data sets that can help us to do this. But the most comprehensive and well-known of these is key biodiversity areas. You're probably familiar, you probably work with this data. A few nods, maybe not. So key biodiversity areas are sites contributing significantly to the global persistence of biodiversity. And these areas are calculated at a national level using globally standardized criteria. So what we did is looked at how protected and conserved areas are protecting key biodiversity areas. And we can see that currently 2 in 3 of these areas are within protected and conserved areas, whereas an entire third falls entirely outside of them. So we really need to be looking at these areas that are being missed by the network and providing some sort of recognition and protection for them to make sure we're capturing these areas that are important for biodiversity. Target 3 also recognises that we need to be protecting areas that are important for ecosystem functions and services. So this is a slightly more complicated element of Target 3 to assess, partly because of limited data, but partly because there is not yet a defined indicator for assessing this within the monitoring framework of the KMGBF. There has, however, been work to map ecosystem functions and services, and so we were able to do an analysis within the Protected Planet report where we looked at the coverage of 5 ecosystem services. So water quality regulation, flood regulation, coastal risk reduction, and vulnerable carbon stock, forestry. And what we can see is that less than 1 in 5 of these areas are currently being covered by the world's protected and conserved areas. So there is, we need to scale up the protection of these areas that are important for ecosystem functions and services. The reality is that we're never going to protect all of these areas because they are important in many ways for us and for humans. And so there will be trade-offs between whether these areas are useful for biodiversity conservation or for other things. But if you do have any questions on this part, then I will direct you to my colleague who did this analysis and can speak more about it. Okay, so Target 3 recognises that our protected and conserved areas need to be ecologically representative. So there are lots of different biogeographic regions with different ecosystems and with different species that all play important roles for nature and people, from rainforests to arid deserts to marine ecosystems. And when we look at how ecologically representative our world's PCAs are, we can see that 1 in 4 ecoregions have more than 30% protection. But the remaining ecoregions are very poorly protected. So this basically tells us that at the moment we've got an issue where we're really well protecting some ecoregions and not some of the others. And so overall, we're not doing a good enough job of protecting biodiversity. And we need to be making more of an effort to protect these underprotected ecoregions. There are 4 indicators within the monitoring framework that aim at looking at how connected our protected and conserved areas are. I'm not going to talk through what those indicators are, partly because I don't understand them myself, But when we looked at the 4 indicators, we can see that currently 8.5% of land is both protected and connected. So when we scale that up to how much land is protected, which is around 17.6%, we can see that we don't have a network of protected and conserved areas that are fully connected. So we need to be making sure that we're improving on that connectivity element. You know, connectivity enables the flow of species, of ecological processes and of ecosystem services. And of course, it's also going to be really important as we adapt to climate change as well to allow the movement of species. Okay, so this slide relates to how effectively sites are being managed. So are they being managed in ways that actually achieve the intended conservation outcomes? Unfortunately, we actually have insufficient data at the moment to monitor this element of the target. What we do know is that 5% of land and 1.3% of the ocean has been assessed at the site level for how effective its management is. Similarly, when we're trying to understand how equitably governed these sites are, so this relates to how fairly are decisions being made and are there equal benefits for local people? We unfortunately have very limited data on this element of the target. What we can do, however, is look at who is governing the world's protected and conserved areas to basically give us a proxy indicator of equitable governance. And what we can see is that the world's protected and conserved areas are primarily managed by governments. So huge swathes of the land or sea are primarily being managed by governments in protected and conserved areas, whereas less than 4% are governed by Indigenous peoples and local communities. So when we look at the extent to which non-state actors are recognised within our well protected and conserved area network, we know that this is an underrepresentation of what conservation actually looks like in the world today, and that we need to do a much better job at providing formal recognition for the conservation efforts of non-state actors. Which leads me on to nicely to my next slide, which, so as I mentioned, Target 3 recognises just how important Indigenous and traditional territories are going to be in the implementation of this target. So we did an analysis in the report that looked outside of the existing protected and conserved area network, how many areas are likely to be covered by Indigenous and traditional territories. And what we found is that 13.6% of global terrestrial areas are likely to be covered by these areas. So if you're paying attention to the numbers, this would mean that if we were to appropriately recognise these areas and add the 13.6% on top of what's already protected at around 17%, we would have already surpassed the 30% coverage element for the target. But this is only going to be successful if the recognition of these areas is done in a way that is appropriate to the Indigenous peoples and local communities, and that follows international human rights laws that relates to their ability to self-determine anything that relates to them or their territories. So it would be really about providing proper recognition and support. And yeah, one of the really big challenges we have with understanding the contributions of these areas is a lack of data. So there's really limited data on Indigenous and traditional territories. However, that is changing. There are so many efforts ongoing from Indigenous peoples and local communities to essentially bring the monitoring that they're doing of their territories up to sort of national and global level to feed international policy. So there's a lot of data collection and mapping of sites happening by Indigenous peoples and local communities themselves, which is going to be really important to the successful implementation of this target. Okay, I wanted to come back to this element of effectiveness. So what's really important to remember about Target 3 is it's not just recognising, it's not just expanding protected and conserved areas, it's really improving their quality, right? And so we have this database, which I mentioned earlier, called the GDPRMA, or the Global Database on Protected Area Management Effectiveness. And currently it only tells us where sites have been assessed as to whether they are effective in terms of their management and governance. We've recently been working with partners to adapt that database to be able to collect information on actually the outcomes of those assessments that they're doing at the site level. So what we'll soon be able to start doing is actually provide information on the outcomes of those assessments in terms of how effectively they're being managed, how equitably they're being governed, but also some of the results of biodiversity monitoring and the conservation outcomes that happen at site level. So this is going to be really transformational in helping us to monitor these really important quality elements of Target 3. I think that's all I wanted to say, but this next slide is work that we've been doing alongside that. So the Protected Area Condition and Threat Index is using remote sensing data to be able to look at and monitor changes in protected and conserved areas in terms of their effectiveness over time. Now, this work is very much seen as complementary to the work that is being done to assess effectiveness at site level, and will be able to give us this much better understanding of how effective protected and conserved areas are overall. And this work is being led by my colleague Sam, so if you do have any questions on it, then feel free to ask. All right, so we got there. That is all of the findings of the report that I'm going to tell you about. There is a lot more to it, so if you want to go online and read the report, then I highly recommend it. I spent about a year of my life working on it, so I'm trying to get as many people to read it as possible. But what we're seeing is that there has been progress on every element of Target 3, but that progress really needs to be scaled up if we are actually to successfully achieve Target 3. And obviously, it's now 2026, and this target is aimed at being achieved by 2030. So, yeah, time is of the essence, but we really need to be scaling up coverage, placing these areas where they are most needed for biodiversity, and then better tracking the quality of these areas, all whilst making sure that they uphold human rights and recognise Indigenous peoples and local communities. So it's no small feat. All right, so this is my final section where we can reflect on whether protected and conserved areas can halt biodiversity loss. So as we've heard, protected areas have been one of the most important tools that we've had for conserving biodiversity for many years. And we know that when they are effectively and equitably implemented, they can protect biodiversity and habitats, promote ecosystem services, support local livelihoods, and also help us to respond to climate change as well. However, they cannot do it on their own. As I showed you at the beginning, Target 3 is one of 23 targets of the KMGBF, and all of those targets were considered important by parties to the CBD for addressing the biodiversity crisis and for halting biodiversity loss. So it's really important that we remember that Target 3 sits as one of these 23 targets, and the successful implementation of all of these targets is going to be important for how well we achieve Target 3. We also must remember that Target 3 is focused on conserving 30% of the world, but that does not mean that we can just do whatever the hell we like with the other 70% of the world. We really need to be thinking about protected and conserved areas as part of broader sort of conservation and development processes. And Target 3 does speak to this when it says protected and conserved areas must be integrated in broader seascapes and landscapes, okay? So it really is thinking across those broader seascapes and landscapes. Protected and conserved areas can't just be isolated pockets of biodiversity. Yes. And that leads me on to the third point, which is that conservation actions do not need to be counted under Target 3 to be important. So there is lots of conservation that's happening outside of protected and conserved areas, and that's what a lot of the other 22 targets speak to, right? But there has been this sort of concern that there is a lot of people are trying to squeeze things into Target 3 statistics, but actually there are lots of targets that represent really good work on biodiversity conservation that can recognise this. And one example might be sustainable agriculture, for example. There is a Target 10 that relates to sustainable use in agriculture, and sustainable agricultural areas might fit better under that target. So it's really important that we're looking across this framework of targets. And then finally, this final point is that, of course, the KMGBF is just a stepping stone towards the 2050 vision of the CBD for achieving harmony with nature. So even though these targets might seem incredibly ambitious to you, in 2040, we're going to need to adopt a new and inevitably more ambitious set of targets. And then again in 2040. So sorry, no, in 2030 we will, and then in 2040 again. And all of this will help us to achieve the 2050 vision of living in harmony with nature. And of course, we've got to remember that Target 3 sits as part of a broader context of global agreements and approaches. So the success of protected and conserved areas to be able to halt biodiversity loss also depends on the success of of how we implement these other conventions and frameworks. So how well we work to mitigate climate change under the UNEP-WCMC is going to make it easier for protected and conserved areas to protect biodiversity, or how well we implement human rights conventions is going to impact on how we can make sure that Indigenous peoples and local communities are recognised in protected and conserved areas, for example. Or equally, protected and conserved areas will also help to achieve the implementation of these other frameworks. So protected and conserved areas will protect important water sources, which of course will be important to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. So there's a real big complex web of international action that needs to happen in order for protected and conserved areas to be successful. All right, so I'm on my final slide. I can see some yawns creeping in. So ultimately, the benefits of protected and conserved areas will be optimised if we can address the drivers of biodiversity loss in order to maximise the climate change mitigation and potential of PCAs. We need to be thinking broadly across landscapes and seascapes and thinking about sustainable management across the world. We need to be making sure that protected and conserved areas are actually in locations that are important for biodiversity, and that includes thinking across country borders. So thinking about transboundary collaboration on these issues. We need appropriate social safeguards and financial resources. We need effective management, equitable governance, and respect in the upholding of rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities. And the KMGBF recognises that we need to follow a whole of government and whole of society approach. So this basically means we need collaboration and coordination across government ministries and agencies, but also across different sectors of society as well. So we need the governments to be working with businesses and private actors and civil society to really achieve this really ambitious set of targets. And then finally, we need to be making sure that we gather and base decisions on protected and conserved areas upon the best possible data. And so that's really what we're trying to do in the Protected Planet Initiative, is making sure that any decisions relating to protected and conserved areas can be made upon the best possible data to ensure that we can actually successfully implement Target 3, including all of its elements. So I will finish there. Thank you very much. Any questions? Kate?
That's really great. So thanks for coming. I guess I'm a little bit shocked on how poorly we understand what's happening in these protected areas. You know, given that we have these targets to meet, you know, why hasn't there been, not you guys particularly, but like the governments of the world, been forced to do monitoring in those? I don't understand. If these are so important for a target, where is the data that's supporting whether we know whether they're successful or not? It's all right to say this is a protected area, but if someone's coming in and hunting it or whatever, and it's not being effectively managed, then it's pointless to paint the box. Right? So where is that? Where is the politics on that? Like, who is insisting that we're going to have or a set of minimum targets that we have to make? Like, you can't lose X %. I'll stop ranting now. No, it's really important, because otherwise,
if you could sort of like integrate the question into the answer, just for the benefit of people online, because I don't think that's...
Yes, sorry. So Yeah, so Kate is asking basically, why do we not have better I don't know why I'm talking to the owl. Why do we not have better biodiversity data to actually tell us how effective these areas are in practice? And I think there are two things. I think there's, so I think when it comes to the global policy and the recognition of the importance of effectiveness, there have been major improvements there in this recent target, which I'll speak to. But then I think the other thing is the reality on the ground of actually assessing effectiveness. So I think with the global policy stuff, I don't have the ICCA Biodiversity Target 11 text with me, but what you can see when you compare the two targets side by side is that our understanding of the need of effectiveness has massively increased just alone within the wording that's in that target. So I think Target 11 spoke about, I think it said we needed effective governance or something, and that I don't think it was really defined what it meant. But then when we came into Target 3, there are so many elements in there that relate to the quality of these systems. And so that's seen as a massive improvement. It's just the target itself, the policy itself, is really improved in terms of how we are focusing on both the quality and the quantity of these areas. So I think with this new target, we have so much more opportunity to really scale up the collecting of that data. I think it is already being done in a lot of places. We've been part of a project for the past 10 years that has been supporting the rollout of these tools that assess effectiveness and that help assess things like biodiversity monitoring and protected and conserved areas. It does need a lot of money. It needs a lot of resources. It also needs continual assessment, right, which we're all familiar with. You can't just do it once and then never do it again for 20 years. So it's a really big undertaking. And I think because the policy wasn't necessarily there and protected areas are really under-resourced anyway, I think we just weren't quite managing it. Now in this new target, there is a new focus on this effectiveness, on the quality of protected and conserved areas. And so I think we are already seeing more data flow into our databases on how effective sites are. And we're seeing more money moving towards sort of scaling up the assessment of effectiveness. So I think the culture is starting to shift. But as I said, there are some countries who have been doing it for a really long time, often ones with maybe a bit more money to put into it. And then I think we're all just sort of catching up on the fact that we need to be assessing these regularly.
I can take all of that, but like in the UK, we are mandated to monitor, right? There's money for a biodiversity programme. So surely we've signed the same agreements as, say, Luxembourg or Belgium or whoever. So why aren't they doing theirs? Like, who's policing this? Like, we have a nationally mandated biodiversity monitoring programme, which does, I think, answers hopefully some of the targets that we have. Like, where is the others? We're mandated to do that. So who's policing this?
Don't know. I mean, I guess this monitoring framework, right, is going to be in a way a form of policing it, but I guess it's not the right. Yeah, I mean, as UNEP-WCMC, we don't see ourselves as policing this.
No, I know that, but why isn't it working? That's why.
Why isn't it working? I cannot speak to the issues of the UK, to be honest. I'm not that familiar. I do know that there was some sort of assessment by the RSPB to look at the effectiveness of the UK's protected and conserved areas, and it was something like, in terms of coverage, I think we're over 30%, but then the RSPB's analysis was around 6% actually delivering on conservation outcomes. So there's a big gap there. And I cannot speak to the UK's context alone. I don't know if you guys have any comment. Yes,
I guess I'd actually be interested to hear too from you.
Yeah.
To how subjective the word effectiveness is there.
It is.
Just as an example, because we have tried over the years to look at, global indicators and to use in the limits of data. Just an example, I remember doing some work with a protected area in Wales that had discovered a rare orchid. So their protected area was all around maintenance of this rare orchid, and they used to dynamite the sand to maintain the keep down session, be able to maintain this orchid. So what they would consider effective is maintenance, is okay, but that doesn't mean restoration to the natural state. And I wonder how much of that kind of, there's a subjectivity of effectiveness.
Huge amount of subjectivity, and as you said, that's why it's been so difficult to define an indicator at the global level. So our colleague Helen has led on this in our team for the past, I think, 10 years. And there's been such a big effort to come together to try and, understand the subjectivity of effectiveness, but then put it into one indicator. It's evolved quite a lot, and the version of the GD-PAME that you can see now, if you go onto the platform, is the best we have at the moment in trying to provide an overview, provide high-level indicators that every country in the world can report on to give us some sort of indication on the effectiveness of sites. So if you go and look at it, it's very high level. It asks questions that relate to, like, you know, do you have defined objectives for a site, and are you monitoring to how well you're achieving those objectives? And so they're basically very, very high level in the sense that they needed to be applied worldwide. And I think it's been a really big challenge. And I think the other challenge we're going to face is actually getting countries to begin reporting on this data, because there's also a lot of sensitivity around effectiveness. So not only do we have that, like, subjectivity of what actually is effectiveness, but then we also have this issue of, well, if a site isn't shown to be effective, then why would I want to provide that data and have people scrutinizing sites in that way? So it's a really big undertaking and will require quite a big cultural shift to be able to actually understand the effectiveness of these sites. But I think that's why the other analyses we're doing around overlaying this data with different other biodiversity data to try and get an assessment of effectiveness is also important, because then we're not relying on those site level information. So we're able to get a sort of sense of effectiveness without even having that site level information, if that makes sense. But it's an area of our work that is really important, as it evolved a lot and will continue to evolve a lot as we work as a global community to try and tackle it, really.
I just want to read out one question that's coming online. How do Indigenous peoples go about getting their affected areas recognised by UNEP, e.g. community conservancies?
Yeah, so firstly, it's not recognised by UNEP. So the data that's in the database we manage, the databases we manage, are primarily protected and conserved areas that are recognised by national governments. And so Indigenous peoples and local communities can have the areas they're conserving recognised within their national protected and conserved area network. So in Australia, there are Indigenous protected areas where there's sort of co-agreements between governments and Indigenous peoples to govern their sites. You have it in Canada as well. Brazil, there's lots of areas that are recognised nationally and protected and conserved areas. So you have the sort of, the database is a reflection of what countries see and recognise as their protected and conserved areas. Then we have a small subset of the data that has been provided directly by Indigenous peoples and local communities. So going back to my very first slide where I showed the definition of a protected area, and I said that these areas can be recognised formally by governments and legally, or they can be recognised through other effective means. That's sort of our international understanding of these areas. And so where Indigenous peoples and local communities want to have their areas recognised, but haven't received formal recognition from the government, they can still report data directly to our databases in order to give visibility to their conservation efforts. And that's a lot of the work that I do. So I work directly with Indigenous peoples and local communities to support them to map and report their sites. In some ways, they see the international recognition and visibility as a means to try and then get national recognition. And particularly with the conversation, so as I said, OECMs is this new concept that's come around in area-based conservation, and we also have Indigenous and traditional territories and discussions around that being another approach. So there are a lot more opportunities now within area-based conservation for Indigenous peoples and local communities to have their efforts recognised. And so we sort of, we see that those are the two ways that the data is coming into our databases. Yes.
I've got a question I couldn't which was how TPOs integrated into that data collection.
Yeah.
So, and whether there's a capacity within the data collection to produce information that is not necessarily database, but is Indigenous led in terms of.
Yeah, really good question. So the World Database on Protected and Conserved Areas, because it's it's essentially it gives a lot more limited information about these sites. So we say we have spatial data on the sites and then different types of information. So we can have in that information that it's governed by Indigenous peoples and local communities, but we don't provide any more information than that. It's sort of a limited amount of information that relates to protected and conserved areas and to monitoring target 3. But I mentioned in the very beginning a separate database called the ICCA Registry. And we created this database back in 2008, working with some partners, some Indigenous and community partners called the ICCA Consortium. I don't know if you're familiar, but this database aimed at being a place where Indigenous peoples and local communities could provide information on the sites they're conserving, but also lots of different types of information, which can include sharing their traditional conservation practices or forms of governance and things like that. So this database goes much more into not just where these areas are, but also how they are being managed and governed in ways that aren't necessarily traditional in terms of conservation. And so this is a really amazing database because the data is provided by Indigenous peoples and local communities. It's not dependent on any form of recognition by governments. It's all based on self-determination. And it provides a mechanism whereby they can sort of get greater visibility and advocate for recognition of their sites, including their traditional practices and knowledge in a way that is appropriate to them. So we sort of have that work going on as well, the ICCA Registry alongside the WDPCA. And as I mentioned, there's that big important discussion within the CBD of how to recognise Indigenous and traditional territories. It's a really complicated one because there's an understanding that the recognition of Indigenous and traditional territories, should be based on self-determination and be led by the communities themselves. But there are challenges with that when we're talking about convention that's the parties of governments and the sort of monitoring and reporting is being led by governments. So there's discussions going on at the moment around how the recognition of ITTs can be done in a way that's appropriate and that, I'll end it there. So I can keep it very
Thank you very much.